All right, tonight we're going to take a look at some more parables of the Lord, and these are in Matthew 13. These are the last ones in Matthew 13. And the first one we're going to deal with is the parable of the dragnet. So if you're not familiar with a dragnet, it's basically like what you see in the picture here, a big net that they could drag through the sea, perhaps between two ships, and capture lots of fish. There's not that many fish in this picture, but the idea in the parable is that it's very full of fish, and then they sort out the good ones and the dead ones, the rotten ones that are not usable. Okay, well, let's go ahead and take a look at that parable. It's in Matthew 13 in verses 47 through 50. So Jesus says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet that was cast into the sea and gathered some of every kind, which when it was full, they drew to shore. And they sat down and gathered the good into vessels, but threw the bad away. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth, separate the wicked from among the just, and cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth." All right, so very simple picture. It's very similar in a lot of ways to one that we've looked at before with the wheat and the tares in the field. Very similar picture, but this time using fishing as the image. So when we put the comparison side by side, the parable, remember it's parallel. You have some physical thing representing some spiritual thing. You have the physical thing being the dragnet that gathers fish of every kind from the sea. And the kingdom of heaven is the spiritual thing, and it includes both the wicked and the just. And so we find that whatever sense the word kingdom is being used here, it includes both the wicked and the righteous. And so in the physical picture, they gather the good fish into vessels, but they throw the bad away. And in the spiritual picture, at the end of the age, the angels will separate the wicked from among the just and cast them into the furnace of fire, where there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. So the main picture here is of judgment. That's kind of the focus here, that there's going to be a separating of the wicked from the righteous, that there will be punishment for the wicked. In the parable of the wheat and the tares, he also talks about the reward for the righteous, but in this one, he doesn't really focus on that. He focuses on the punishment of the wicked, that they will not be caught up into the reward just because they're mixed in with the righteous. You cannot think that you're going to go to heaven just because you have righteous friends or because you go to a good church or anything like that. You're going to be sorted out. And so you must not be among the wicked if you want to avoid this outcome that Jesus shows us here. So when we talk about the parable of the tares and the wheat, the kingdom was the whole world, is what Jesus said, and that's under the kingship of Christ. That might be the case here as well in this parable. That would work with the picture. Most people think that it's referring to the church, that the kingdom here is the church, and that may also be true. In the parable of the tares and the wheat, you have the entire field being harvested. That's the judgment on the whole world. But in this parable, you see the net taking fish out of the sea, but it's not clear if it takes all the fish out or just every kind of fish. So it could be talking about the net being the kingdom as far as the church is concerned, taking all these different kinds out of the world, which is the sea. And in that case, you're seeing a focus on the judgment of those that are in the church. But honestly, the outcome is really the same either way. It doesn't make a big difference which way it is, because Jesus is king over all, and the judgment goes to all. But of course, we are told that judgment begins in the house of God. And so if you are in the church, even if you're in that net, if that's what that represents, or you believe you're in the church, you think you're saved, but you're not actually behaving righteously, maybe you haven't been made righteous, so you're not even in the church. But even if you were made righteous, but you're not living righteously, it's not going to save you. Just being there, just being part of that kingdom, if you're not walking according to the king's direction. There is going to be a separation of the righteous and the wicked are going to be punished. And that's the picture that Jesus is giving us in this parable. So whether the kingdom here is the church or the whole world really makes no difference in the long run. We know that just being part of his kingdom is not going to save us. We can go back to the parable of the sower, where there were different kinds of ground that responded to the gospel, that obeyed the gospel, but did not bear fruit. And they were not going to be saved in the end. It's only those that bear fruit. So just because we're in the kingdom in either sense does not mean that we're going to be saved by the king. We have to actually submit to the king if we want to be saved. All right, the other parable that we're going to look at is one that I never really thought of as a parable before, but it does seem to fit the definition, and that's the parable of the householder at the end of Matthew chapter 13. And he's bringing out treasures old and new. I wasn't really sure how to picture that, so I just had him with an old antique something and a laptop computer, right? Those are both expensive things, and yet one's old, one's new. They're useful in different ways, right? So that's just what that picture represents. But this is what we read in Matthew 13, verses 51 and 52. Jesus said to them, "Have you understood all these things?" They said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he said to them, "Therefore, every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure things new and old." So this almost just sounds like a statement. It's not exactly put in the same way as most of the parables, and if you want to say it's not a parable, well, that's fine, but it's important at least in the context of the parables. I think he's teaching us something about it here, and he's drawing a parallel, which is why I say it can be a parable. You have a householder. That's the physical thing, which is contrasted with a scribe who's instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven. And then this householder brings out of his treasure things new and old. And Jesus does not explain what that means regarding the scribe. So we have to try to understand it. So what is a scribe? A scribe was someone who would write down. Generally, they would make copies of many things, but in particular, the Old Testament at this point. So they were considered experts on the Old Testament because they had written out at least large parts of it by hand as they copied it. And so they had it in their mind more than many other people did. So they were considered experts on the Old Testament. And so they had that old treasure. But when he's instructed in the kingdom of heaven, now he has new treasures. He has something new that he can combine with what he knows from the old. And so he's making that statement about a scribe. But he's saying that in response to the disciples who were not scribes exactly. I don't think any of them were considered scribes. But they were saying they are understanding his parables now. At the beginning of the chapter, they didn't understand. They had to ask, what does this mean? What does this mean? Now he's asking them, do you understand it? They're saying yes. And he says, therefore, that's what this is like. And so as they're learning these parables, they can understand more and more. So now they can say they understand what he's talking about, even though earlier they didn't. And the same should be true for us. The more we learn about the parables that Jesus explains, the more we can understand those that he does not explain. But that's true of more than just the parables. That's true of the whole Bible. The more we learn about different parts of the Bible, the better we can understand the other parts. The more we understand the character of God in one place, the more we understand why he behaved the way he did somewhere else, because his character doesn't change. If we learn about God in the Old Testament, we understand about God in the New Testament, because he's the same God. And so we don't understand everything about God and his plan from the Old Testament. We need the New Testament to tell us what it is that he was actually carrying out all this time, what he had planned, his incredible love for us through his Son, and the sacrifice that he made. And we can learn these things and further understand the Old Testament as well. But we need to be able to combine these things together to have this great ability to bring out treasures, old and new, that are useful for ourselves and those that we are trying to help. So when we look at these two parables, when you look at the parable of the dragnet, the main focus is the judgment and the punishment of the wicked. And whether the kingdom here is the church or the entire world, the idea is the same. When you're judged on the day of judgment and you're considered wicked, you're considered a bad fish. There's nothing that's going to save you from the fire. That's the end. You have to be the good fish when you're gathered up. And so make sure that you are turning to the King, that you are listening to him and serving him. And there's no reason not to, because everything he tells us is for our own good. That's not in the parable, but that's the truth. Everything he tells us is because he loves us, so there's no reason not to listen. With the householder that he talks about, we understand that the more we learn, the more we can understand. He's taught this in a number of other places as well, that idea. So if you don't know the Old Testament, there's a lot in the New Testament that you're not going to fully understand. You need to know the Old Testament to improve your understanding of the New Testament. And the more you understand the New Testament, the more you're going to understand in other parts too. So there are things that the New Testament helps us understand about the Old Testament, but also within the New Testament, the more you learn, the more you'll understand other parts of the New Testament. So we need to just keep growing, learn more and more, and then those parts that have been very difficult for us will start being not so difficult. And particularly with the parables, the more we learn from the parables that are explained, the more parables we can understand that are not explained. And that seems to be what's happening with the apostles and other disciples. They start off not understanding anything, but once Jesus explains some of the parables, they can start understanding even the ones that are not explained. And so that's where we want to be in our search for understanding God and understanding what he wants from us. We want to go from please explain this to me to now I understand. And so we just have to keep growing. We have to keep learning. And nobody's going to get to the point that we know everything, but we can understand a lot more than we do now if we will just keep listening, paying attention, seeing what Jesus actually says, paying attention to his words, and just incorporate that understanding into the harder things. All right. Well, that's the lesson that I have for tonight. Thank you.